The longest match in the world is between Magnus Carlson vs Ian Nepomniachtchi. The professional match is conducted on World Championship match. In 2021, the white side is of Magnus Carlson and black side is of Ian Nepomniachtchi. Magnus Carlson carries 2,855. Magnus Carlson is the top-rated players in the world. He is the most famous and top-rated players. On the other side, Ian Nepomniachtchi carries 2,782 rating. After Magnus Carlson and Garry Kasparov, he is the most top-rated player in the world. He won the title of World Championship and plays in the Russian team. In the match, time control for 40 minutes 7,200 plus 0 for plus 20 moves. This match was conducted on the 3rd of December 2021. The result of the match is 1-0. As white wins in the match. Event was Carlson Nepomniachtchi World Championship match. The round was 6. So as we starts the game between the best players. The match starts and Magnus Carlson starts the match with queen's pawn game. As he moves d4, Ian Nepomniachtchi also moves the queen's pawn, d5. Continues the queen's pawn game. Next move is nf3, as Ian Nepomniachtchi also moves nf6. The opening continues and Magnus' next move was g3 on Pe. Opposite side Ian moves e6, then Magnus moves bishop to g2, and Ian move bishop to e7. Then castle of both sides. Both players castle at same time. The match is in same position till now. After castle Magnus moves b3, and Ian moves c5. Magnus capture the first piece is d cross c5. Ian also capture the pawn with bishop, b cross c5, then Magnus moves c4, up next d cross c4. Then the players brings the queen outside as he moves qc2. Ian also moves the queen at qe7. After that Magnus moves the knight of b1 at d2, Ian moves the knight to nc6. After that knight cross pawn at c4, as n cross c4, then Magnus move the pawn at b5. There are alternative moves also, we can move also the pawn to e5. And after that bishop at b2. But the Magnus moves knight of c4 at e5, as nce5. After that Ian moves knight at b4. Then the queen moves at b2, as q. b2. Then bishop moves to b7, as bb7. After these moves, Magnus moves the pawn at a3, by attacking on knight. Ian saves the knight and moves backwards to nc6. Magnus also moves the knight to d3 and attacks on bishop. After that Ian protects the bishop and moves to b6. Then Magnus moves the bishop to g5, and pin the knight. After that Ian moves the rook of f8 to d8. Bishop capture the knight at f6 and attacks on queen. Then Ian capture the bishop with the pawn, g cross f6. Then develop the rook of a1, moves to c1. Ian moves the knight to d4 and attack on the knight. There are also alternative moves. Ian can move pawn to e5 and Magnus can move nh4. But Magnus capture the knight as n cross d4. Then bishop also capture the knight, b cross d4, and attacks on queen. Magnus save his queen and moves to qa2. After that, bishop capture bishop at g2. Magnus capture the bishop by the king. As k cross g2. Ian gives the first check of the match, as queen moves b7 and check, qb7 check, king again moves to g1. And save himself. Then, Ian moves queen to the e4, then Magnus moves his queen to c2 and brings the major piece together. Ian moves the pawn to a5. There are alternative moves also, rook ac8, q cross c8, r cross c8, R cross C8 Ĝg Kg7. But the Magnus moves rook of F1 to the D1 and collects the pieces together. Then Ian moves king to G7, then Magnus moves the rook at D2 and supports the queen. The alternative move is E3, then Ian moves rook of A8 to C8 and attacks on queen. Magnus smartly moves the queen and capture the rook at C8. After that, Ian captures the queen at C8 and have a plus position in comparison to Magnus. Magnus also moves smartly and capture the second rook, also at C8. Both have same position, as Ian have queen and Magnus have both rooks. Then Ian moves queen to B5. Magnus moves his pawn, and wants to capture the pawn, B4. Then Ian saves his pawn and moves to A4. Then Magnus attacks on the bishop by the pawn, E3. Ian saves his bishop and moves to E5. At this position there are so much alternative moves, as it is added on description. You can check the moves there. Then Magnus moves his pawn to H4. Open the files for king. Ian repeat the move, as he also moves H5, but there is inaccuracy. Bishop B2 was best. Magnus moves his king to H2. Ian moves the bishop to B2, but later, again there is inaccuracy. QB3 was best. After that, Magnus attacks on queen and moves his rook to C5. Ian saves his queen and moves to D6. Then Magnus does a blunder as he moves rook to D1. There are more best moves. You can check the moves in description. Ian takes the benefit of the blunder and capture the pawn by bishop as B cross A3. Then Magnus also capture the pawn as R cross B5. Ian moves his queen to D7 and attacks on rook. But Magnus saves his rook and moves to C5. Then E5 again inaccuracy. Bishop cross B4 was best. Then rook moves to C2 again inaccuracy from the white side. E4 was best. Then Ian moves queen to D5 and again it is a blunder. B cross B4 was best. Magnus moves the rook of D1 at D2. After that Ian moves queen to B3 and supports the bishop. Magnus moves the rook to A2 and attacks on bishop. Then Ian does a mistake, as he moves to E4, but F5 was best. Knight moves to C5 and attacks on queen. Queen captures the pawn at B4 and attacks on knight. Magnus saves his knight as he moves knight cross E5 blunder here. Road C2 was best. Again Ian moves his queen to B3 and protects the bishop. Now Magnus moves the rook of A2 to C2. Then he moves bishop to F8 and gives support to king. Magnus again attacks on queen, as he moves knight to C5. Again alternative moves are here, described in description. The real moves are Ian saves his queen to B5. Again Magnus saves his knight and moves to D3. Ian moves his pawn to A3 and wants to promote his pawn. Then Magnus smartly moves the knight to F4. Ian gives supports to pawn as he moves queen to A5. But Magnus restricts the pawn and moves the rook to A2. Then Ian attacks on rook as he moves bishop to B4. Magnus saves his rook and double attacks on the pawn as he moves RD3. Then Ian moves king to H6. Again Magnus moves rook to D1. Ian attacks on rook by moving queen to A4. Then he saves his rook by moving to A1 and supports to rook and pawn. After that Ian attacks on knight, as he moves bishop to D6. Magnus brings his king out of the corner, as he moves to G1. Ian moves his queen to B3 but also support the pawn. Then Magnus moves his knight to E2. Ian attacks on knight by moving his queen to D3. But Magnus saves his knight and moves to D4. supported by pawn. Then Ian moves his king to h7, Magnus also saves his king and moves to h2. Now Ian leaves the support for pawn, and moves the queen e4. As he plans to checkmate in the corner. Now Magnus captures the pawn, destroy the pawn promotion, as r cross a3. Now Ian captures the pawn at h3 check, on the other side the pawn is pinned. Magnus have no option but king can move to g1. Now the queen moves to e4. Now the Magnus moves the rook to a4 as it is a trap for black. Now the Magnus moves the knight to e2 and attacks on queen. Black saves his queen and moves to c2, also attacks on knight. Now, Magnus again attack on queen as he moves r1 a2. Again black saves his queen as the queen moves to b3. Now Magnus covers his king by pawns as he moves the king to g2. Again Ian attack on king as queen moves to d5 check. Magnus saves his king by moving pawn to f3. Ian again moves his queen. And he moves to d1. White attacks on bishop by moving pawn to f4. Black saves his bishop and moves to c7. Again white gives support to knight and moves the king to f2. Now black moves his bishop to b6 and pinned the e3 pawn. White attacks on queen and moves the rook to a1. Now, black moves his queen to b3 and want to attack on e3 pawn. But Magnus gives support to pawn and moves rook to e4. Now black moves his king to g7 and wants to save his king. Now the white moves his rook to e8 and wants to attack on king. Black moves his pawn to f5 and gives open square to move for king. Now white brings his second rook and moves to a8, planning to attack. Black gives support to king and moves the queen to b4. White moves his ra rook to c8. On the other side black also planned the trap, as it moves the bishop to a5. Now the white defend the checkmate, as moves the rook to c1. Again black attack. On e3 pawn, bishop moves to b6. White attacks on f5 pawn. And moves the rook to e5. Black moves the queen to b3. And double attack on e3 pawn. Again, white backs his move and move the rook to e8. Black moves the queen to d5 and also wants to save his king. Magnus brings the rook the opposite side. At c8. And plan the trap. Now Ian moves the queen to h1 and wants to attack on king. Again white moves the rook to c1. And again save the king. Again black moves the queen to d5. White attacks on bishop and moves the rook to b1. Black moves the bishop to a7 and accuracy in this move. Bc7 was best. White moves his rook to e7 again attack on bishop. Black moves his bishop to c5 and attacks on rook of e7. White attacks on queen and moves the rook to e5. Black save the queen and moves to the d3. White moves the rook to b7 and again wants to attack on king. Black moves the queen to c2. And pin the knight. Magnus attacks on the bishop, as moves the rook to b5. Ian saves the bishop and moves to the a7. Magnus again attacks on the bishop as it moves the rook to a5. Now black attacks on rook also, as it moves the bishop to b6. Magnus again attack on bishop as it moves the rook to b5. Again black moves the bishop to a7. White captures the pawn at f5. Have one more pawn. Black moves the queen to d3 as it wants to attack on a3 square. White captures the pawn at f7 and check. There is a trap beyond the move. Black capture the rook by king at f7. Here white sacrificed the rook. Now white moves the rook to b7 and double attack on the king and bishop. Black moves the king to g6 and save himself. But white have Opportunity to capture the bishop, and white do the same as rook capture the bishop at a7. Now black moves the queen at d5. The white have rook and knight, and also 3 pawns. But the black have queen and 1 pawn. So the white have better position. Magnus again gives check to black, as it moves rook to a6. Black defend the check and save the king, as king moves to h7. Now white moves the rook to the a1, and wants to trap the king. Now the black moves the king to g6 and queen can save the king. Now the Magnus moves the knight to d4 and wants to trap the queen and king. Now the black defend the trap and save the queen and moves to b7. Now the Magnus move the rook to a2. After that, the black moves the queen to h1 and wants to attack on king. Magnus gives the check to the king and moves the rook to a6. Now king defend the check, and moves the king to f7 and save himself from check. Now the Magnus moves the knight to f3 and wants to attack on queen. But black defend the trap, and moves the queen to b1. Now the Magnus moves the rook to the d6 and plot against the black. Black know the plot and moves the king to g7. Again, Magnus moves the rook to d5 and attack on the remaining pawn. Black moves the queen to a2 and have a double attack on king and rook. To save king, rook moves to d2, and save the king and rook both. d2 have support of knight. Now the black moves the queen to b1 and again wants to attack on king and rook. White moves the rook to e2 and gives support to king. After that black moves the queen to b6 and wants to destroy the coordination of white. Magnus moves the rook to c2 and wants to attack on king. Again black attacks on rook of the white as it moves to b1 again. White protects a rook by giving the support the c2 square. As knight moves to d4. Again black moves his queen to h1 and gives the support to the pawn. Magnus moves smartly and gives check to the king as rook moves to the c7 square. Black saves the king by moving to square f6 and protects from the check. Again, Magnus gives the check and moves the rook to the c6 check. Black again moves to the f7 and defend the check. Magnus again wants to trap the queen as he moves the knight to the f3. Again black defend the trap and moves the queen to the b1 square. Now the Magnus moves the knight to g5 check. There is inaccuracy in move, nd4 was best. Again the black moves the king to g7, also inaccuracy, ke7 was best. Magnus again moves the knight to e6 and check to the king, and wants to trap the king. But black moves very smartly as he moves the king to f7 and save himself. After that the Magnus moves the knight to d4. Again Ian moves the queen to h1 and wants to trap the king. Then Magnus moves the rook to c7 and check. For the king, Magnus continually attack on the king. Again black saves his king and moves to the f6. Again a trap for the queen as knight moves to the f3. Black saves his queen and moves to the b1. After that white moves the rook to the d7. Again the same position happened, queen moves to the b2. And check to the king. Attacks on the king. To save the king white moves the rook to the d2 and also attack on the queen. Again black moves the queen to the b1 and save the queen from the rook. After that white moves the knight to the g1 and plot a plan against the black. Black attacks on the rook as queen moves to the b4. After that white saves the rook from the queen and moves the rook to the d1. Black moves the queen to b3 and wants to delay the match. But white moves smartly and attacks on the king by moving the rook to the d6 check. Black saves the king from the check and moves to the g7. After that white moves the rook to the d4 and wants to support the pawn. Now black attacks on the king and moves the queen to the b2 check. White defends the check and moves the knight to e2 and protect the king. Black moves the queen to the b1 and not want to sacrifice the queen. Now the Magnus wants to promote the pawn as he moves the pawn to e4. Again black moves the queen to h1 and wants to destroy the pawn. Promotion. Again the Magnus attacks on the king and moves the rook to the d7 check. And wants to take the opposition. Now black have to save the king first, then he can capture the pawn. So he moves the king to g8. After that again white supports the pawn as it moves the rook to the d4 and have a back to the pawn. Now the black attacks on the king as he moves the queen to the h2. There are alternative moves as h4 and g cross h4, but the real moves are white save the king to the e3. But the alternative move is king f3. After that black moves the pawn to h4, but he moves the pawn late. As usual white captures the pawn at h4. There is no option, but capture is also good one option. After that black moves the queen to h3 and attacks on the king. Also wants to capture the pawn at h4. Now the white moves his king to the d2 and save from the check. But lose the support for the pawn. Then white moves the rook to the d3 and planning a trap for the black. After that black moves his king to the f8 as he knows the plan of the Magnus. Then the Magnus moves the rook to the f3 and gives double support to the pawn of f4. After that moves black moves the queen to the d8 and attacks on the king by check. Again white saves his king and moves the king to the e3. Again black moves the queen to a5 and wants to attack on king. Now Magnus moves his king to f2 and covers the king with the knight and rook. Black moves the queen to a7 and attacks on the king. White saves his king by moving the rook at the e3 dot. Now the black moves his queen to the d7 and again wants to attack on the king. After that white moves his knight to the g3. Ian again attacks on the king by moving the queen on the d2 check. Again, the white saves his king and moves the king on the f3 square. After that again black attacks on the king by moving the queen to the d1 square. White moves his rook to the e2 and saves his king. Again black attacks on the king and moves the queen to the b3. Black continuously gives check to the white. But again white saves his king and moves the king to the g2 square. Now black moves the queen to the b7 and pin the e4 pawn. After that, Magnus moves his rook to the d2 and 124 moves was the longest match of the World Championship, but this match gives a new record. Again black moves the queen to the b3. After that Magnus moves his rook to the d5 square. And wants to promote the pawn. Now the black moves his king and wants to defend the pawn promotion. But Magnus attacks on the king and moves the rook to the e5 square. Black saves his king and moves the king to the f7 square. Again white attacks on the king and moves the rook to the f5 square. Black again saves his king and moves to the a8 square. Now the white moves his pawn to the e5 and wants to promote the pawn. Again black attacks on the king and moves the queen to the a2. White saves his king and moves to the h3 square. Then black moves his queen to the e6 as wants to block the pawn, but that is inaccurate move. qb1 was best. Again white moves his king to the h4 and unpin the rook. Again black moves his queen and attack on the king on the h6 square. White again saves his king and moves the knight to the h5 square. After that black moves his queen on the h7 square and wants to capture the rook. After that Magnus moves his pawn to the e6, but the rook have no support. Then black moves his queen to the g6 blunder move. Queen at e7 check was best. Now the Magnus moves his rook to the f7 that will help in pawn promotion. Black moves his king to the d8 square, but the alternative moves are queen cross e6 and ng7. Check. Magnus smartly moves the pawn to f5 in attacks on queen and also support the e6 pawn. After that, black moves his queen to the g1 and saves the queen from the pawn. Now the Magnus moves the knight to the g7 and supports the e8 square. But Ian Nepomniachtchi resigns after that. But there are some assumed moves by the grandmasters. These moves are following. Black moves the queen to h2 and attacks on the king. White saves his king and moves to the g5 square. Again black attack on king and moves the queen to the g3 as he wants to delay the mate. Again white saves the king and moves to the h6 square. Black moves his queen, again attacks on the king by moving on h4. Again white saves the king and moves to the g6 square. Again attacks on the king. Queen moves to the g4 square. Again white saves the king and moves to the h7 square. Again attack on the king. Queen moves to the h4 square. After that white moves the king to the g8 and no more checks after that. Black moves the queen to the g3 square and pin the knight. White moves the pawn to the f6 and supports the knight. Black moves the king to the c8 and defend the mate. White moves the pawn to the e7 as only one square left for pawn promotion. Black moves the king to the b7 as the rook is blocked by the pawn. After that white promotes the pawn into a queen as it moves to the e8 square and check to the king. Black saves the king to the b6. White moves the queen to c8 as wants to block the files. Black moves the queen to the g2 as wants to block the queen. Black moves the rook to the g7. Black attacks on the king and moves the queen to the g5 square. White moves the pawn to f7 and saves the king. Black moves the king to a5 as wants to defend the mate. White moves the queen to the b8 and wants to checkmate. Black moves the queen to the b5 as wants to block the queen. White captures the queen at b5 and now the black have only king left. King captures the queen at b5 as king have no option. White again promotes the pawn at f8 into queen. Now the checkmate is sure. King moves to the a4 square as wants to delay the mate. Queen moves to the b8 square and block the b rank. Black moves the king to a5 as only a rank is left. At last white moves the rook to the a7 and checkmate as king have no safe place to go.